This could have happened because she was fighting him off and like scratching him, or they could have just been having some good, you know, So the judge is like, bitch, could you stop, please? Could we just not? Go, Jordy. It's your birthday. So you're saying, detective, that in your expert opinion, there might be another way to look at this. I feel bad for her right now. She's getting grilled in front of a whole ass courtroom. That's embarrassing. Objection, Barry said. Good old Barry. Do you remember that conversation we had? He couldn't get a lawyer. He couldn't do shit, right? He's in a hospital bed on drugs. It's not looking good for Chris. Welcome back to another episode of our book club series. If you're new here and you don't know who I am, my name is Brooke. I have different types of content on my channel. What you are watching right now is a continuation of our book club series. We are reading The Pact by Jodi Picoult. I have lost the cover. We read chapters of the book together, and then we discuss the characters, the drama, and our theories about what we think might happen. So if you enjoy books and book discussions, then stick around because you will definitely enjoy this type of content. If you want to catch up to where we're at right now in the book and the discussion, I have a playlist on my channel called Book Club The Pact. I will link that up here for you to find that. Or if you prefer to just watch the last few videos leading up to this one, you are welcome to do that as well. However you choose to catch up, we would love to have you join in with us. I always do a quick recap of the last few sentences we read in the last video, just so that we're all up to speed and everybody knows what's going on. Other than that, today is reading number 23, and I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So, when we left off last time, when we ended last time, the trial for the murder of Emily Gold had just begun. So I feel like there's something that I forgot to discuss last time. Oh, okay, so there was like this scene last time in the courtroom, and Chris had been brought in handcuffs, which was like this big deal because Jordan, Chris's attorney, felt like it was a tactic from the prosecution to make Chris look dangerous by bringing him in handcuffs. So Jordan was like, is livid. He's pissed as fuck about this. He's just going off. But while all this is happening, this heartfelt scene between father and son is going on. And it's a big deal because up to this point, Chris's dad has sort of only, we have been given the impression that Chris's dad up to this point has really only cared mostly about his reputation or his how he looks to other people, his appearance. And so he's kind of just avoided this whole mess, right, with Chris being on trial for murder, that whole thing, right? So he's just been kind of like out of it. He's just been kind of avoiding the whole thing. Back to now, in the courtroom, Chris is brought in handcuffs, and James, his dad, jumps over like the railing where he was sitting just so that he can sit with Chris and hug him, like in front of all these people, in front of, you know, everybody in the courtroom and all the cameras. And it's like this heartfelt scene where he finally doesn't give a shit about the reporters and what other people think, and he's just focused on his son. And so I forgot to mention that last time, but that was kind of a big deal. And the trial begins. Yeah, I think that's it. I'm just going to get started. So I'm going to read like I usually do. I'm going to read the last few sentences where we left, and then I'm going to move on to the next section. So I'll set the scene. Barry Delaney, the prosecutor, has just laid out her case in front of the jury, and now it's Jordan's turn. That's where we've left. It's Jordan's turn. And he is ending his opening statement, if you will, to the jury. So that's where we left, and that's where we're going to pick up right now. When this trial is finished, you'll have more than a reasonable doubt, and you'll know that this is not about murder. Emily Gold wanted to herself, and Chris decided to join her. He loved Emily so much that life wasn't worth living without her. Jordan shook his head and turned toward Chris. That's not a crime, ladies and gentlemen. That's a tragedy. Okay? And now we're going to move on to the next section. The prosecution calls Detective Anne-Marie Marone to the stand. There was a slight buzz as the first witness was sworn in. She settled down with the ease of someone who's played a particular house before, her gaze level on the jury. Anne-Marie Marone was wearing a simple black suit. Her hair was twisted up in a knot at the back of her head. With the exception of the holster peeking out from beneath her jacket, it was easy to forget she was a policewoman. Barry Delaney crossed in front of the witness stand. Please state your name and address for the court. The detective complied, and Barry nodded. Could you tell us in what capacity you were employed? I'm a detective sergeant with the Bainbridge Police. And how long have you worked there? 10 years, she smiled, this June. There was a brief exchange about her training, her work at the police academy, and her experience within the police force. Then Barry stopped pacing, her hand on the railing of the witness stand. Who was in charge of the investigation surrounding the death of Emily Gold? I was, the detective said. Did you determine the cause of death? Yes, a gunshot wound to the head. So there was a weapon involved in this case. A Colt .45. And were you able to retrieve the weapon? Anne-Marie nodded. It was at the scene of the crime, she said, lying on a carousel. We took the gun and a variety of ballistic tests on it. Is this the gun you retrieved from the scene of the crime? Barry asked, holding up the Colt .45. That's it, Detective Marone said. Your Honor, Barry said. I'd like to enter this as Exhibit A. She went through the customary procedure, showing the gun to Jordan, who dismissively waved it away. Then she turned back to the detective. Did you determine where the gun came from? Yes, it was traced back to its owner, James Hart. James, behind the defense table, started at the sound of his name. James Hart, the prosecutor said. Is that any relation to the defendant? Objection, Jordan called out. Relevance? I'll allow it, the judge said. The detective looked from the judge to Barry Delaney. It's his father. Did you have a chance to interview James Hart? Yes. He said that the gun was a collector's item, but still used for target practice. He also said that his son was familiar with the gun, had access to it, and used it as well for target shooting. Can you tell us about the tests you ran on the weapon? Detective Marone shifted in her chair. Well, we determined that there was one bullet fired, which went into the victim's temple, exited the victim's head, and lodged in the wood of the carousel. We found the casing from that bullet still in the chamber of the gun, as well as a second bullet that had not been fired. Christopher Hart's fingerprints were on both of those bullets. Barry pointed. By Christopher Hart, you mean the defendant? Yes, Detective Marone said. Barry turned to the jury, as if she was deliberating over this tidbit for the first time. So, his fingerprints were on both bullets. Did you find anybody else's fingerprints on the bullets? No. And what, in your expert opinion, does that suggest? He was the only one who handled the bullets. I see, Barry said. Were there any other tests done on the weapon? Yes, a standard ballistics tests checked for fingerprints on the gun itself. We found both Christopher Hart's and Emily Gold's fingerprints on the gun. However, Mr. Hart's fingerprints were all over it. The victim's fingerprints were only on the barrel of the gun. Ooh, that looks bad. It's not looking good for Chris. The victim's fingerprints were only on the barrel of the gun. Can you show us what you mean? Barry asked, picking up the Colt with its new exhibit tag. The detective easily palmed the gun. Mr. Hart's fingerprints were here, and here, and here, she said, pointing. Emily Gold's fingerprints were only in this region. She scraped her fingernail along the blunt steel barrel. But to shoot this gun, Detective Marone, you would have to have your hand where? She waited for Anne-Marie to indicate the butt of the gun. And Emily's fingerprints were not there. No. Yet, Mr. Hart's were. Objection, Jordan said lazily. Asked and answered. Sustained, Puckett said. Barry turned her back on Jordan. Was any other testing done at the crime scene? Yes, we did a luminol test, a fluorescent spray that detects blood spatter patterns. Based on that, as well as the angle of the bullet that eventually lodged in the carousel, we deduced that Emily Gold was standing up when the bullet was fired, and that someone else was standing very close and slightly in front of her. We also know that she lay on her back and bleeding for several minutes before she was moved into the position in which officers first found her when arriving at the scene of the crime, which was bleeding profusely with her head in the defendant's lap. And did the luminol pick up anything else? Yes, a large stain not tied to the spatter pattern of the bullet wound, where the defendant supposedly struck his head. Objection. Jordan gestured at Chris. Would you like to see the scar? Puckett gave Jordan a measured glance. Continue, Miss Delaney, he said. From that stain, is it possible to determine how or why the defendant fell down? Barry asked. No, the detective said. It only shows that he still lay there for about 5 minutes, bleeding. I see. Any other tests? There was gunpowder residue found on both the victim's and the defendant's clothing. We also tested the corpse of the victim for gunpowder residue on the fingers. And what did you find? There was no gunpowder residue on Emily Gold's fingers. With a victim holding the gun in her hand when she shot herself, would you normally find gunpowder residue on the hands? Definitely. That's why I started to think Emily Gold did not kill herself. Barry was silent for a moment, assessing the faces of her jury. And they were hers now. Every single one of the 12 sat on the edge of his or her seat. Several were taking careful notes on the provided pads of paper. Was there anything else you found at the scene of the crime? We found a bottle of Canadian Club liquor. Ah, underage drinking, Barry said, smiling. Oh, goodness. The detective grinned, too. Okay, so how did he strike his head? He struck his head, bleeding profusely with her head. Luminol test, blood spatter, angle of the bullet that eventually lodged in the carousel. Emily Gold was standing up. Someone was standing very close in front of her. She laid on her back, bleeding for several minutes before she was moved into the position in which officers first found her when arriving at the scene of the crime. So she was moved. And she was standing up. So she didn't have gunpowder residue. And that's why they don't think that she killed herself, because there was no gunpowder residue on her hands. Okay, the detective grinned, too. It wasn't my biggest concern at the time. At this, Jordan objected. Your Honor, he said, if there was a question somewhere in there, I missed it. Y'all, this is not looking good for Chris right now. This is looking really bad for Chris. Puckett rolled an almond about on his tongue, neatly tucking it into the pouch of his cheek. Watch yourself, counselor, he warned Barry. Was there anything that stood out in the autopsy report? Anne-Marie nodded. The victim was 11 weeks pregnant. The prosecutor walked the detective through the interviews she'd done with the friends of Emily Gold, her neighbors, with one glaring exception, her parents, her teachers. Detective Marone, did you also have a chance to speak to the defendant? Barry made sure to catch Anne-Marie's eye. The detective was good, a professional. But she'd been forewarned to not mention the conversation that she'd had with Chris at the hospital. Ruled inadmissible, even its mention could be cause for a mistrial. In case y'all forgot, because I forget a lot of things, so we'll just refresh her here. This detective that's on the witness stand right now, who Barry is interviewing, she interviewed Chris while he was still at the hospital under the influence of pain meds and who knows whatever else. You know, in a hospital bed, he couldn't exactly just get up and walk away or really like protest, you know, if you will. So that's what it's referring to when it says the detective was good, a professional, but she'd been forewarned to not mention the conversation she'd had with Chris at the hospital. Ruled inadmissible, even its mention could be a cause for a mistrial. It was ruled inadmissible because Chris couldn't say no, or he couldn't get a lawyer, he couldn't do shit, right? He's in a hospital bed, on drugs. He couldn't do shit about it, basically. It says Barry made sure to catch Anne-Marie's eye. She's like, hey, remember when we talked about, you know, you've been there. You've done that before. When you look at somebody and you're like, you remember that conversation we had? Just zip. Yes, I did. He came down to the police station on November 11th. So she just glides right over that one, buddy. Yes, I did. He came down to the police station on November 11th. I read him his rights. And he waived them. Is this the police report transcribing the conversation on November 11th? The prosecutor held up a file, emblazoned with the logo of the Bainbridge Police. It is, the detective said. How soon, detective, after your meeting with Christopher Hart, did you write this report? Immediately after he left. What was the gist of that conversation? Mr. Hart basically told me he brought the gun to the scene of the crime, went to the scene of the crime, and watched Emily Gulch herself. Did that add up to the evidence you had seen? No. Why not? Detective Marone cocked her head, staring at Chris. He felt his cheeks redden and forced himself to keep his gaze steady and direct. If it was just one of those things, instead of all of them, if it was only that the bullet traveled through the victim's head at a weird angle. Objection. Or if there were bruises on her wrist, but everything else seemed consistent with suicide. Objection. Or if even one person described her as troubled, but too much just didn't add up. Objection, Your Honor. The judge narrowed his eyes at Jordan. Overruled, he said. Barry's heart was pounding. So, it wasn't a suicide, in your expert opinion, in spite of what the defendant has told you. From what you had seen of the evidence, the fingerprints, the blood spatter patterns, the gunpowder residue, the liquor bottle, the interviews, did you form an alternative theory of what happened? Yes, Detective Marone said firmly. Christopher Hart had murdered her. How did you come up with that? Anne-Marie began to speak, weaving a picture that hung in the courtroom like a tapestry, rich in detail and impossible to ignore. Emily was a happy kid that no one, not teachers, not parents, not friends, considered depressed in any way. She was pretty, popular, had a great relationship with her parents, a model daughter. She was 11 weeks pregnant with her boyfriend's child. And Chris was a senior in high school, about to go off to college, already applying. He was certainly at a point where he did not need a baby in his life, or a girlfriend who was clinging to him. Jordan considered objecting. This was all speculative, but realized that would only hurt him and make the detective's testimony take on more importance than he wanted it to. He sighed loudly, hoping to convey to the jury how ludicrous he found Marone's theory. The detective lowered her voice, and the jury strained forward to listen. So he arranged to go to the carousel for some kind of romantic rendezvous. He gave her something to drink, trying to get her intoxicated so that she wouldn't fight him when he pulled out the gun. They had sex, they got dressed, he pulled her into an embrace, and before she knew what was happening, there was a gun pressed to her head. Anne-Marie raised her own hand to her temple, then brought it down. Just for dramatic effect and emphasis, Anne-Marie's like... Anne-Marie raised her own hand to her temple and then brought it down. She fought him, but he was a lot bigger and stronger than she was, and he shot her. That, she said, sighing, is how I see it. Barry headed back to her table, almost ready to relinquish her witness. Thank you, Detective. Oh, and one last question. Was there anything else important that came out of your interview with Chris Hart at the police station? Anne-Marie nodded. He had to sign a paper to agree to the interview. It's standard procedure. And he picked up the pen with his left hand. So I asked him about it, and he told me he was indeed a lefty. And why was that significant, Detective? Because we know from the path of the bullet and the pattern of the blood spatter that someone else was there, facing Emily. And if that person shot her in the right temple, he had to have done it with his left hand. Thank you, Barry said. Nothing further. Shit's eating up. Next section. When Jordan stood up for his first cross-examination, he smiled at Anne-Marie Marone. Detective, he said. We all heard you tell Miss Delaney that you've been with the police force for 10 years. 10 years. he whistled. That's a long time to be in the public service. Anne-Marie nodded. Too smart and too practiced at this to relax, as Jordan intended. I like what I do, Mr. McAfee. Yeah? Jordan said, grinning widely. Me too. In the jury box, someone snickered. In 10 years, Detective, how many homicides have you worked on? I just feel like so much stuff is about to be revealed in this trial that we don't even know yet. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we already know everything. Like, maybe it's not, but I just have a feeling that some shit's gonna be revealed in this trial that me and you don't yet know about. This is the culmination of everything. All right, back to it. Okay, I'm focused. In 10 years, Detective, how many homicides have you worked on? Oh God, 2. 2, Jordan repeated. 2 homicides. He wrinkled his brow. This is the second? This bitch has only done 2 homicides? And this is their, like, star detective witness? Okay, sure. 2, Jordan repeated. 2 homicides, he wrinkled his brow. And this is the second? Correct. So you've only worked on 1 before this? Yes. Well then, why did they pick you to be in charge of this investigation? High color rose in Anne-Marie's cheeks. It's a small department, she said, and I'm the head detective. It falls to me. So, it's your second murder, he said, stressing the utter lack of this expert's expertise. And you started off by looking at the gun, is that right? Where is he going? Where do y'all think he's going? Tell me in the comments. Where do y'all think he's going with this? And you started off by looking at the gun, is that right? Yes. And you found 2 sets of fingerprints on it? Yes. And you found 2 bullets? Yes. But if someone was going to shoot you at a very close range, he wouldn't need 2 bullets, would he? That depends, the detective said. I realize this is somewhat new to you, Detective, Jordan said. But yes or no will do. He saw Anne-Marie set her jaw. No, she gritted out. On the other hand, Jordan continued breezily, wouldn't it make sense that if you and a friend were planning to commit a double, you'd need 2 bullets? Yes. And Chris's fingerprints were on those bullets? Yes. Is it consistent with a double that Chris's fingerprints be the only ones on the bullets if, by Chris's own admission, it was his father's gun and he brought that gun? Yes. In fact, wouldn't it be unusual to see Emily's fingerprints on the bullets loaded into the chamber since she had no experience with guns at all? I guess so. Wonderful. You also told Miss Delaney you did some testing on that gun. That's correct. You found Emily's fingerprints on the gun, along with Chris's, didn't you? Yes. Isn't it true that you found additional fingerprints on the gun? Yes. Some that matched up with James Hart, the defendant's father. Really? But he wasn't under suspicion during your investigation. Anne-Marie sighed. That's because his fingerprints were the only evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime. So you can't only rely on fingerprint evidence, can you? Just because someone's fingerprints are on a gun doesn't mean they happen to be touching it that particular night. That's correct. Ah, you found Emily's fingerprints on the top of the gun, Jordan said, walking over toward the display of evidence. Any objection to me picking this up? He asked, gesturing to the Colt. He lifted it in his hand gingerly. Gingerly. And you found Chris's fingerprints around here, on the bottom. That's right. But you found no conclusive fingerprints on the actual trigger of the gun. No, we did not. Jordan nodded thoughtfully. Is it true that you need only a 1/4 inch of a fingerprint, a very small area indeed, to make a conclusive match? Well, yes, Anne-Marie said, but it has to be the right 1/4 inch, a particular spot. So fingerprints aren't as easy to pick up as it looks in the movies? No, they're not. Can they get smudged by newer fingerprints? Yes. In fact, Detective, testing for fingerprints is far from an exact science, wouldn't you say? Yes. If I pick up this gun and fire, and then you pick it up and fire, is it possible that my fingerprints would not show up on that trigger? Maybe not, Anne-Marie conceded. So is it possible that Emily pulled the trigger, and then when Chris picked up the gun, he erased, if you will, her original fingerprints? It's possible. Let me recap. Even though Emily's fingerprints were not identified on the trigger during your testing, Detective Marone, can you say without a doubt that she never touched that trigger? No, but then again, Chris could have touched it too, without it showing up. She smiled neatly at Jordan. Jordan drew in his breath. Let's talk about the luminol, he said. You said that the blood spatter pattern on the carousel indicated a spot where the defendant was bleeding. I assume so. He was bleeding from a scalp wound when officers arrived. Yet, you say it's not proof that Chris fainted. So, are you telling me, he said scornfully, that Chris lay down on the carousel floor, smacked his head on the edge, and then lay there for several minutes to let a pool of blood form? Anne-Marie looked down her nose at him. It's been done before. Really? Jordan asked with true surprise. I assume that was during one of your... I assume that was during your one previous murder case? Objection, Barry said. Good old Barry. Sustained. Puckett glared at Jordan. I don't have to warn you, Mr. McAfee. Jordan walked to the exhibit table. Is this a transcript of your interview with Chris Hart? Yes. Can you read this line right here? He brought the papers to the detective and pointed. Anne-Marie cleared her throat. We were going to ourselves together. That's a direct quote of something that Chris Hart said to you. Yes. He told you outright that this was a double... Yes, he did. And can you tell me what this says on page 3? The detective glanced at Barry Delaney. There was a pause in the tape. Why? I had to shut the recorder off because the subject was crying. Chris was crying? How come? Anne-Marie sighed. We were talking about Emily, and he got very upset. In your expert opinion, is that consistent with genuine grieving? Objection, Barry said. My witness is not an expert on grief. I'll allow it, said the judge. The detective shrugged. I suppose so, she said. So let me get this straight. In the middle of this interview, an interview where Chris Hart waived his right to have me present and said flat out that he and Emily were going to commit together, he started crying so hard that you had to actually stop the tape? Yes, Anne-Marie said pointedly. But we didn't have a lie detector hooked up either. If Jordan heard her, he showed no sign of it. You mentioned that in your theory, Chris was trying to get Emily drunk. Yes, I believe that. The idea being that she would be submissive, Jordan clarified. Correct. Did you, by any chance, have the coroner check Emily's blood alcohol level? They do that automatically, the detective said. Did you find out what it was? Yes, she said grudgingly. 0.02. Which would be consistent with what, detective? Anne-Marie coughed. 1 drink, maybe 1 shot for a small girl. She had 1 shot of alcohol out of that whole bottle. Apparently, yes. And the legal level for driving in this state is what, detective? 0.08. What was Emily's again? I told you, Anne-Marie said. 0.02. Considerably less than the legal limit for driving while intoxicated. Would you say that she was drunk then? Probably not. You mentioned evidence of gunpowder on both Emily's and Chris's clothes, Jordan said. Isn't it true that if you find gunpowder on the shirt, all it really proves is that the fabric was in close contact when the gun was fired? That's correct. Can you determine from gunpowder residue on clothing who actually shot the gun? Not conclusively, but we didn't find any gunpowder residue on the victim's hands either. And the perpetrator of a suicide would have had some sort of trace of powder on her skin. Jordan seized on that. Is it consistent with a murder investigation to immediately bag the hands of the victim? Ordinarily, yes, but when was the gunpowder test performed on the corpse? Anne-Marie looked at her lap. November 9th. You are saying you didn't test Emily's hands at the scene of the crime, and you didn't test her on the way to the hospital, and you didn't even test her in the morgue until 2 days after she died? Is it possible that during that block of time, someone had tampered with Emily's hands? Well, yes or no? It's possible, Anne-Marie said. Could someone have touched Emily's hands during the trip from the crime scene to the hospital? Yes. Such as medics or uniformed officers? Either would be possible. In the emergency room of the hospital, might someone have touched her hands? Damn, he's on one. Jordan is on one. He is rolling right now. But good for him. In the emergency room, might she have been swabbed down since there were no instructions otherwise? Yes, the detective said. So any number of people might have tampered with important evidence before you got around to collecting it from Emily's hands, Jordan summarized. Yes, Marone admitted. Wouldn't it also be consistent with a murder investigation to immediately test the hands of the perpetrator for gunpowder residue? He's really good, but I mean, this is a book, but either way. Jordan is on his shit. That's standard procedure. When you first saw Chris at the scene of the crime, did you test his hands for gunpowder residue? Well, no, but he wasn't under direct suspicion then. Jordan's eyes widened. Really, Detective Marone? He wasn't a suspect when the police got to the scene of the crime? No. So when did it dawn on you that he was a suspect? Objection, Barry called. Counselor, why don't you rephrase that question? Puckett said dryly. I'll move on. Did you test him at the hospital? Jordan hammered. No. Did you test him the next day, when you went to gather more information? No. Did you test Chris the day he came into the police station for that interview? No. This lady don't know shit, does she? I feel bad for her right now because she's getting grilled in front of a whole ass courtroom. That's embarrassing. Did you test Chris the day he came into the police station for that interview? No. Jordan snorted. So he was never tested for gunpowder residue. Not at first, when he was not a suspect, and not later, when you decided he was a murderer. He was never tested. Isn't it possible that if you had managed to test Emily's hands before someone had tampered with them, you might have found gunpowder residue on them? That's possible. And that would have indicated that she had fired the gun? Yes, it would, Anne-Marie said. And if you had tested Chris for gunpowder residue right at the scene of the crime, you might not have found any on his hands either? That's right. And that would have indicated that he hadn't fired the gun. Correct. And then none of us would have to be here. And that would have indicated that he hadn't fired the gun. And she's like, correct. And then there's like this little sidebar in Jordan's head. And it's like, and then none of us would have to be here. Jordan did not have to say the words. He walked to the jury box, standing at the end as if he was one of its members. Oh my God. He walked to the jury box, standing at the end as if he was one of its members. Okay, detective, your theory is that Chris was at the scene of the crime. He put 2 bullets in the gun in case he missed the first time from 1/8 of an inch away. He unsuccessfully tried to get Emily drunk, had sex with her, went for the gun. Emily saw him going for the gun, they wrestled, and then he shot her. You absolutely believe this is what happened? Yes, I do. Not a single doubt in your mind. None. Jordan moved closer to the witness stand. Couldn't the fact that there were 2 bullets in the gun that night have meant that there was going to be a double suicide? Well, couldn't it? It could, Anne-Marie sighed. And couldn't the Canadian Club have been there to take the edge off of a suicide attempt? Maybe. And might there have been fingerprints on that gun that weren't in the right spot or clear enough to have been picked up by that test of yours? Yes. And might another gunpowder test, one that for whatever reason wasn't done, have shown that Chris Hart did not fire that gun? Maybe. So you're saying, detective, that in your expert opinion, there might be another way to look at this? Anne Marie Marone exhaled through her mouth. Yes, she said. Jordan turned his back. Nothing further, he said. Go, Jordy. It's your birthday. Now, this is the next section. The jury, not to mention the judge, was getting glassy-eyed, a common response to heavily detailed police testimony. Judge Puckett called for a 10-minute recess, during which the courtroom emptied. Selena grabbed Jordan's arm on his way back from the men's room. Nice work, she praised. You've got juror 5 for sure. I think juror 7. It's early yet. Still, she shrugged, rubbing his arm lightly. On the other hand, your client is falling apart. She gestured toward Chris, visible through the courtroom's doors. Chris was still seated at the defense table, 2 bailiffs and a sheriff's deputy standing guard behind him with their arms crossed, a physical barrier to contact. He's just spent an hour hearing what a sociopath he is, and there isn't even a friendly face in the courtroom. Jordan peered at Chris, his body hunched slightly over the table. His father's here, he told Selena. Yeah, but Ward Cleaver he is not. Jordan nodded and ran a hand through his hair. All right, he said. I'll talk to him. You should, unless you want him to pass out cold at the ME's testimony. Jordan laughed. Yeah, he'd probably crack his head open on Barry Delaney's chair rollers. And she'd still find a way to make it look like Chris was faking. With a light squeeze of Selena's hand, Jordan made his way back into the courtroom. He nodded at the entourage surrounding his client. Gentlemen, he said, slipping into his chair and waiting for them to disappear. It's going well, he said to Chris. Really? To his surprise, Chris laughed. I hope so, he said, because it seems a little early to throw in the towel. Then the smile fell away from his face, revealing, as Selena had said, the tightly drawn mouth and pale countenance of a very frightened teenager. You know, Jordan said, I realize it's hard to hear yourself described as a monster. The prosecutor is allowed to say whatever she wants. But so are we. We just haven't had our turn yet, and we've got the better story. That's not it. Chris ran his fingers over the blue lines of the legal pad. It's that. The prosecutor's making it real. It's been 7 months, you know. But there's all this technical stuff, and the blood, and where Emily was, and where I was, and... He paused, burying his head in his hands. She's making me live it all over again, and I could barely survive it that once. Jordan, who could confidently slay any prosecution's witness with his words, who had 1,000 answers for any of Barry Delaney's questions, stared at his client, speechless. Poor Chris. That's rough. I mean, he's already gone through something incredibly traumatic, the loss of his girlfriend, being there when she died. Horrible. You know, you've got to live with that for the rest of your life. You've got to think about that. You have to have that picture in your head, you know, and you're trying to just deal with that and not lose your fucking mind. And then now you got to hear yourself being talked about like you did it. It's rough, man. We are on the next section. The medical examiner for Grafton County, Dr. Jubal Lumbano, was a thin, bespectacled man who looked far more suited to chasing butterflies with a large collector's net than rooting around elbow deep in the innards of a corpse. It took Barry Delaney a full 10 minutes to get Lumbano's credentials down on the record, and to make certain the jury knew that here, at least, was a witness with experience. The unprepossessing Dr. Lumbano had completed over 500 autopsies during his career. Dr. Lumbano, Barry began, did you do the autopsy on Emily Gold? Yes, the medical examiner said, his nose bumping against the microphone with a screech. Leaning back, he smiled apologetically. Yes, I did. Can you tell us what was the cause of death? All findings were commensurate with the cause of death being a .45 caliber bullet fired against the skull into the brain. More precisely, entering the right temporal lobe, missing the frontal lobe, and exiting from the right rear occipital lobe. Barry admitted a chart into evidence showing the outline of a three-dimensional head surrounding a brain. Then she turned to the jury with a helpless smile. Dr. Lumbano, for those of us not as intimate with occipital and temporal lobes, could you use this chart to show us where that bullet went? She handed the medical examiner a magic marker, blood red, and the doctor carefully set it against the drawing. The bullet went in here, he said, making an X at the right temple. Then it traveled this approximate path and exited above the neck, here. Another X, behind the right ear. The line between them ran almost parallel to the side of the diagrammed head. We're going to break this down together, because I'm trying to understand this also. So let's break this shit down. It says the bullet went in here, making an X at the right temple. So it went in here. Check. That way, and then came out here somewhere. Is this the correct trajectory? The line between them ran almost parallel to the side of the diagrammed head. Yeah, okay, so that makes sense. Can you tell us how long it took for Emily Gold to die? Barry asked. It wasn't immediate, Dr. Lumbano said. She was still alive when the medics got to her. She may even have been conscious for some of that time. Conscious? And able to feel pain? Certainly. Barry looked appropriately horrified. So, Emily lingered, possibly in pain, for how long? I would say a half hour or so. Dr. Lumbano, did you find any other marks on Emily Gold's body? Yes. Did they indicate violence? Your Honor, she's leading, Jordan cut in. It remains to be proved that any violence occurred. Sustained, Puckett nodded at the prosecutor. Miss Delaney, don't lead your witness. Were there any distinguishing marks on Emily Gold's body, Doctor? Yes, there were bruises on her right wrist. What did that lead you to believe? That some violence may have occurred. Might they have been caused by someone pulling at her wrist? Out of the corner of her eye, Barry saw Jordan open his mouth. Let me rephrase that, she said, before he could object. What would you, as a medical expert, attribute to the cause of those bruises? It's possible that they were caused by someone who had grabbed her wrist. How soon before death would you say those bruises were formed? Within an hour pre-mortem, Dr. Lumbano said. Oh, shit. Okay, so I don't know if we knew this. I don't know if I knew this yet. Or if I did, I don't remember. But I guess Emily had bruises, like, on her right wrist. And the medical examiner is saying that these bruises happened, like, within an hour before her dying. Within an hour pre-mortem, Dr. Lumbano said. The blood had just begun to rise to the surface of the skin. Was there anything else you discovered during the autopsy? There was evidence of semen, which, with the condition of vaginal tissues, suggested recent sexual activity, approximately a half hour before death. There was also skin under the victim's fingernails, cell samples of which did not match up with the victim's own skin. If they were having sex, I can see how that could happen. So it said, let's pause here for a second. Skin cells under her fingernails when they found her. Which, I mean, this could go either way, right? This could have happened because she was fighting him off and, like, scratching him, or they could have just been having some good, getting it on or whatever, and she was having a good time. Anyway, sorry, doing a little bit of scratching, if you will, in the act, and that might be why. We don't know that, but that, I mean, this could go either way. Cell samples of which did not match up to the victim's own skin. Which indicates what? She scratched someone. Did you determine whose skin was under her fingernails? Yes, the tissue samples matched those taken from Chris Hart and brought in by the detectives. Barry nodded. Could you tell whether Emily was left or right-handed? Yes. All of the calluses were on her right hand. Heavy calluses on the left side of the middle finger and the right side of the second finger. In my medical opinion, I would say the victim was right-handed, and the gunshot wound was through the right temple. Yes, it was. Barry nodded thoughtfully. Have you seen a lot of suicides, Doctor? Oh, a fair number. 60 to 70. Were any of those caused by a gunshot wound to the head? 38, Dr. Lumbano said. It's a popular method, I'm afraid. Of those 38 suicides, how many used a pistol or a revolver? 24, Dr. Lumbano said. And how did those 24 suicides shoot themselves? I'd say 90% shoot themselves in the mouth, because that's what works. The other 10% shoot themselves through the temple, although I did see one strange case where a man shot a bullet up his nose. In the 10% of the people who point the gun at the temple, where is the exit wound? On the opposite temporal lobe. He pointed at both of his temples. And where did Emily Gold's bullet exit? From the same side occipital lobe. Moving his left hand behind his head, he pointed to a spot behind his right ear. Did you find that unusual? Yes, as a matter of fact, the medical examiner said, his cheeks pinkening with excitement. I've never seen anything like it. It would be very difficult to hold a gun to your right temple and have the bullet exit the right rear of the head. It requires the angle of the gun to be something like this. Dr. Lumbano lifted his right hand, pointed his finger like the barrel of a gun, and held it up against his right temple, almost parallel to his head, twisting his wrist in a forced, unnatural position. In my opinion, that's not objection, a typical position. Objection, sustained, Puckett said. Took your sweet time, Jordan muttered beneath his breath. What was that, counselor? The judge slid a nut into his mouth. Did you say something? No? He turned to the jury. Please ignore Dr. Lumbano's last statement. Barry approached her witness. In your medical opinion, Dr. Lumbano, what did that leave you to believe? Speculative, Jordan yelled again. Come on! Your Honor, request permission to approach the bench, Barry said, nodding at Jordan, who joined her in front of the judge's high desk. Miss Delaney, Puckett said, the only way you could lead this witness anymore would involve putting a collar around his neck. So the judge is like, bitch, could you stop, please? Could we just not? The only way you could lead this witness anymore would involve putting a collar around his neck. Barry bit her lip. If my witness can't speculate on this, I'd like to be able to show the jury what I'm trying to get at. But I'll need the assistance of the defendant. Jordan looked from Barry to the judge. He had no idea what the hell she was going to do, and he wasn't about to give her free rein with his client. I want to know what she's up to, he said. Puckett turned toward the prosecutor. Delaney? She spread her hands. A little demonstration, Your Honor. I want to show the jury how Chris could have done this. Absolutely not, Jordan hissed. That's completely prejudicial. Look, Your Honor, Barry said. I'm going to make my point. I'll use the doctor or a bailiff if necessary. I just need a body. Why not use the one allegedly involved? Puckett cracked an almond. Proceed with caution, counselor, or we'll be right back up at the bench. What? Jordan exploded. I've ruled, Puckett said firmly, and to Barry, go ahead. Dude, that's crazy. What? That's awful. So she's gonna use, did y'all hear this shit? Okay. So Barry, the prosecutor here, is gonna make Chris get up in front of all these motherfuckers and like relive this nightmare, which we don't even really know what happened yet, but her speculations, you know, her story, if you will, about her theory about what has happened that she's presenting to the jury, okay? She's gonna have Chris get up there and demonstrate it. That's just torture. Let's see how this goes. Jordan walked back to the defense table, thinking that at least now he had an appealable issue. Sliding into his seat, he touched Chris's shoulder. Oh God, poor Chris. I'm not sure what's up her sleeve, he whispered. Just look at me and I'll nod or object if she's out of line. At this point, Barry was walking towards Chris. Okay, Dr. Lumbano, I'm going to have the defendant help. Okay, Dr. Lumbano, I'm going to have the defendant help me out here. She smiled at Chris. Would you please stand up, Mr. Hart? Chris glanced at Jordan, who nodded imperceptibly. He stood. Thank you. Could you come over here? She gestured to a spot slightly in between the jury box and the witness stand. Now, Mr. Hart, if you'd extend your arms out in front of you. She gestured like a Frankenstein monster until Chris hesitantly raised his arms, and Barry Delaney walked right into them. Chris started as she embraced him, her hands coming around to the tails of his jacket and her body flush against his. He stood stiff as a board as her head tucked onto his right shoulder, falling onto the same spot Emily's had when he used to hug her. What, he thought, is going on? Mr. Hart, Barry said, her voice slightly muffled against the weave of his blazer. So she's got him standing up like this, like fucking Frankenstein. And she has walked right here and put her fucking head right here. And she's like nuzzled up, like getting cozy over here. Could you put your arms around me? Poor Chris. He's got to be so uncomfortable and just like, I can't imagine the stress. Okay. Chris looked at his lawyer, who nodded tightly. Now, could you take your left hand and put it up to my right temple? With his eyes trained on Jordan, who for all his recent objecting was now sitting as still as a damn stone, Chris complied. They were facing in such a way that the jury had a clear view of Chris leaning back maybe 8 inches. So he's like... They were facing in such a way that the jury had a clear view of Chris leaning back maybe 8 inches. Just enough to put his left hand up to the right side of the prosecutor's head, while his right arm still embraced her. Something like this. Now, Dr. Lumbano, Barry said, if there was a gun in Mr. Hart's hand right now, how likely would it be that the trajectory of a bullet fired at my temple at this point might exit at the right rear occipital lobe? The medical examiner nodded. I'd say there's an excellent chance that would happen. Thank you, Barry said, her arms falling away from Chris, her brisk footsteps leaving him standing alone in the middle of the courtroom. Jesus, Chris hissed, his face red as a beet as he slipped into the seat beside Jordan. Why didn't you do something? I couldn't, Jordan said through his teeth. If I jumped up, the jury would think you had something to hide. Oh, well, great. As opposed to what they think now? That I'm a fucking murderer? Don't worry, I'm going to take care of it on the cross. He stood, assuming that after that debacle, there was little else Delaney could want with her witness, but was stopped by her voice. One more question, Barry said. Was there anything else about Emily's physical condition that you noticed during the autopsy? Yes, Dr. Lumbano said. On the night Emily Gold died, she was 11 weeks pregnant. Jordan closed his eyes and sat back down. He's like, oh, fuck, here we go. I'm going to end today's reading there. I feel like things are still just heating up. What do you guys think? Who are your favorite characters? Who do you relate to? What do you think is about to happen? Put it in the comments. If you want to keep watching, I will link the next book club video up here for you so that you can click on that if you want to keep watching. I love you guys. I love that you enjoy this as much as I do. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Tap the like and subscribe buttons and have a wonderful day.
How y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.